We try to do a mixture of old and new, that is people who've been around for a long time and people who haven't been around. People who are newly minted PhDs and people who've had their PhDs for a while. Really funny people as opposed to really unfunny people. Rod Blackwood is the funny, newly minted, sort of minted person for this semester. Actually, I had to twist his arm to do this, but I think that everybody who I've had to twist their arm has said that it's been nice to go back and explore their past a little bit and think about how they got to where they are. So we're happy that Rod has agreed to share his story with us, and please welcome.
Well, she had to work really hard not to insult me, didn't she? And I'm not sure she was successful, but I really hadn't figured it out yet. You know, it's amazing how much of an impact grandparents have on you. I had, of course, 4 grandparents, but I had 2 grandmothers that had a real impact on me. One of them was about 5'2", and the other one was almost 6 foot tall. My dad's mom was tall, my mom's mom was short. And both of them said something to me at one point that has altered my life. And I want to share those with you. By the way, I'm going to tell you some things about me that I don't even know whether Sandra knows about me today, so get ready for this. My little grandmother one day saw me out playing in a red ant bed and stomping and covering them up with dirt. And so she brought me into the house and she said, "Now just think of how you would feel if some big giant came around and started stepping on you and covering you alive in dirt." And she said, "You wouldn't like that, would you?" And I said, "No, ma'am, I sure wouldn't." So I have spent my entire life making sure that everything that I was going to bury was dead. So I'm going to come around after this talk, and I'm going to check your pulse and make sure whether you're dead or not. Okay?
Is death by stomping okay? Or?
Yeah, death by stomping's okay. But my other grandmother, and I'm sure I deserve this just like I did the other one. My other grandmother said to me one day, she said, "You know, every time you use the word I in a sentence, you're bragging. And nobody likes to hear a person brag." So I have spent my entire life trying to figure out how you talk without putting I in a sentence. Now I'm going to violate both of those principles today because I don't know how to do this otherwise, you know. So I'm going to use I because that's kind of what's involved in this this thing that's going on. Let me see if I can. I want to start. No, wrong one. I'm going to start with family, because family has, you have to understand a little bit about my family in order to yeah, good, it's upright. In order to understand my academic career, you need to understand how far I am away from a PhD or even college. This is a picture of my dad about the time he got married. My dad was very intelligent. He was very creative. Anything new that came up, he was on top of it. Whether it was new crops, whether it was new irrigation systems or watering systems or whatever, he was on top of it and spent hours learning new things. He loved to read and he loved to learn new things. This is my mom about the time she got married. Little bitty, 5'2", 5'3", sweet, wonderful mom, housewife. Spent most of her life raising me and my brother, and then spent about 15 or 20 years after I went off to college being a bank teller in Muleshoe, Texas, where everyone would wait in line to go to her window so that they could talk to her. So that's my mom. This is the farm that my mom was raised on. Now, this was probably made, I'm guessing, sometime right before I was born. It's a It's a section of dry land in Crosby County, about 12 miles south of Crosbyton, just before you drop off into the Cap there as you go along. It was rented. My family never, up until my uncles, never owned any of the land that they lived on. Well, my dad did when we moved to Muleshoe, but and so they were tenant farmers, and my mom had, there were 7 of them, and they were all raised right here on this place, and most of them stayed fairly close to that and continued to farm in that. My dad and my mom lived about 3 miles to the south and to the west of that on another section of land that was basically just about like this there in Crosby County until I was about 6 years old. This happens to be a picture of my mom and dad's wedding picture, my mom's mom and dad right next to them, wedding picture, and then my dad's mom and dad's wedding picture. And I just thought that was kind of interesting to see. My granddad on my mom's side was about 6'2", tall, slender, very quiet, very dignified, very gentle kind of man. And I could talk about him a lot too, but I don't have time to do all that. But I want you to see, none of these folks and none of my mom's brothers and sisters, my dad was a family of 11, none of which went to college. And on both sides, they were all very intelligent, very curious, very innovative, very learn-oriented, but college just wasn't in the picture. This is me. I was born in Rawls, Texas, because Crosbyton didn't have a hospital at that time. And I know you're probably thinking, I didn't even know they had hospitals that long ago. Well, they did. This is just a picture. I guess I was probably about 2 years old in that particular picture. This is about the age at which we moved to Muleshoe. This is my younger brother, who was 4 years younger than me. I was about 6 when we moved to Muleshoe. My dad bought the first piece of land that he ever owned in his life in Muleshoe as a half section of irrigated land. So he went from dry land farming to irrigated farming and moved to Muleshoe. And again, I was about halfway through first grade. And I loved my first grade teacher in Crosbyton, Miss Sherwood. She was wonderful. She was the most outstanding teacher you've ever heard of. And we moved right in the middle of that. I told my mom, I will never forgive you, and I will never, ever like school again. Well, I had, Mrs. Boone was my first grade teacher in Muleshoe. I was determined to not like her. But she literally took me under her wings, and by the end of the semester, by the end of the year, I went up to Mom one day and I said, you know, Mom, Miss Boone's almost as good as Miss Sherwood. And of course, Mom just fell apart, you know, and she was so happy that I felt that way. But anyway, that's my younger brother. And in Muleshoe, you know, we were agriculture. We were cowboys. I grew up on a half section of irrigated land in which we grew cotton, and we grew, okay, get ready for this one. We grew castor beans in the same half section of land that we ran cattle and sheep and hogs and horses, sesame seed, wheat, you name it. Again, as I said, Daddy was innovative and we tried lots of different things. One of the things we did, again, you'll understand this, is we grazed our cattle and sheep on alfalfa pastures way before there was any way to control bloat, which is very prevalent on that. And we figured out ways to do that before there was chemical ways of controlling it. But anyway, I wanted you to see this picture because you can see how nice, innocent I look there. And my brother, on the other hand, you can tell and look at him, he is mischievous. And he literally was in trouble all of his life because he just couldn't keep from getting caught. So I put this picture up, and it's right out of an annual. It's this picture of me in my sophomore year. And I put it up there because it was a very important turning point in my life. Somehow, about this time of the year, in my 8th grade year, I started having trouble with my back. And it was really unusual, and they took them a long time to figure out what it was. But I had had an injury of some sort, and I call it a football injury because that sounds really good, but we really don't know how it happened. But what had happened was one of the vertebrae in my lower back was bruised from a blow that I had received, and I took a spurt of growth, and that part of the vertebrae didn't grow where the rest of the vertebrae did, and so all of a sudden I've got things that are happening all up and down my back and what have you. And so during the summer between my 8th grade year and my freshman year, they put me in this brace that came up over my shoulders and down and sat on my hips and strapped around. For 2 years, I could not work. I could not run. All I could do was walk, read, and do those kinds of things. We didn't have TV. I didn't get TV till I was more like a junior or senior in high school. And so, you know, I learned some things from that. Number one, I'd grown up working constantly all my life, and I didn't really appreciate how important being able to work was to who you are and what you do and all of that kind of things. But 2 years of not being able to even sit on a tractor or anything like that changes your whole attitude about sitting on a tractor or whatever it is that you happen to be doing. And so I learned to appreciate the value of physical labor and what have you. My whole family, both sides of my family from wherever, were athletes, really good athletes. My dad still holds a record in the shot put in the state of Texas. And I had uncles that held the record in the hurdles and things like that. I mean, just incredible athletes. Here I am, 2 years into high school, and I have not run a step. And so I go out for football the next spring, and I'm not very big to begin with, and I get to play, and I actually get a chance to go on and play basketball here at LCU a little later on, and I think part of that comes from a work ethic that I learned sitting on the couch. But it was just a great experience that I got to have with athletics, and so I wanted you to see that because that 2 years impacted me tremendously about everything else. This is a picture that's taken about probably when I was about 19, maybe 20, and I show this picture because I want you to hear this conversation. I was not very pleased with my college degree. I came here to LCU, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, but I finished up at Tech with a degree in animal science. And Dad and I were having this conversation one day about bloat on alfalfa and what causes it and how you prevent it. And we were having this conversation, and it was like equals. I'd been almost 4 years in college. I'd had all of these courses about agriculture and what have you. And he and I are talking, and he's never even set foot in a college place, except when he came down to visit me at one of those places. And I said, see, 4 years in college was a waste. Here we are talking at the same level and with each other. And my dad looked at me and he said, you know, you're right. You did that in 4 years. It took me 40 years. And it just slammed. Why, okay, so maybe that is something that's beneficial. But I say that because that was an influence, that kind of quiet guidance. When it came time to choose a college, I had already deposited my room deposit at ACU and was headed down there, and Mom and Dad were going to let me do whatever I wanted to. And LCU offered me a $125 scholarship. Dad didn't say anything, Mom didn't say anything. They just said, well, Dad looked at me one day and he said, you know, $125 is $125. So I came to LCU. And that was a changing point in my life. At LCU, I ran into another guy that had a great impact on me by the name of Glenn Davis. I don't know if there's anybody in here that knows Glenn Davis. A few do. But Glenn taught agriculture here at LCU, and he was the most incredible teacher I think I'd ever sat in the classroom with. And I just sat there and listened to him. I think, how can anybody be that smart? How can anybody know that much? And how could you be able to communicate that so quickly and so easily to someone who knows nothing? And so I was just really impressed with him. And he gave me a chance to teach labs, both while I was at LCU and then later on while I was at Tech. He asked me to come over and teach some science labs for him. And then after I'd graduated, actually was the person who hired me to come back and manage the farm at LCU. But that's a little bit later on here in the story. This is a picture of my mom and dad when they were about their 50th wedding anniversary. So I wanted that. Now, at about this time, whenever I was about that age of 19, 20 in college, my life changed from my immediate family to this young lady here. By the way, this picture has traveled all over the world with me while I was in the Air Force and what have you. And you can see why. And you can see why my heart got taken away as well. So, in 1965, this kind of thing starts happening. And as I said, my emphasis changed from one family to another. I know I look funny, don't I? But anyway, that's pictures at our wedding. Right after we got married in 65, I started to work for LCU in the fall of 1966. And I don't know if you remember what was going on then, but it was the Vietnam era. And there were ways to get deferments. One of them was to be in school. They took that deferment away about that time. One of them was to get married. They gradually took that one away. The third one was to go back to graduate school. So I'm going to graduate school. All the rest of them are gone. Now, coming back to LCU, I knew I was going to have to do master's work. So in fall of 1966, I started working on a master's degree. I got halfway through that semester, and I just happened to go back up to Muleshoe. The draft was going crazy with the Vietnam War and everything, and everyone was being drafted. And so I went back, and the deferments were all gone. So I went back up to Muleshoe, and I asked them, I said, how long do you think it will be before my number, it wasn't a number, but before I come up? And they said, oh, it'll probably be a couple of months. And I had already been doing some investigation and taking some tests and what have you, and had been accepted into the Air Force, into officer training school. And so that was my intent, and that was my plan. And so the day we were supposed to, I was supposed to go to Amarillo, take my physical, and be enlisted into the Air Force. We left about 10 o'clock that morning to go up, had to be there 1 o'clock or so to start through all of that. I went up there and did that. They went through and gave us a physical. They did all the paperwork and everything and brought me in. Got back home, we spent the night, got back home the next morning, and in my mailbox, this is 2 weeks after I'd been up to the draft board, in my mailbox is a greetings from the government saying, you've been drafted. Well, because I'd already enrolled and enlisted and all of that kind of thing, I didn't have to go that way. So I was commissioned in February of 1967. We spent 4 years in the Air Force. This is a picture of me in my mess dress uniform. This was while we were in Minnesota. We lived in Minnesota, Duluth, Minnesota. We lived in Phoenix, Arizona, Panama City, Florida. And I spent a year on a little bitty island out in the middle of the South China Sea called Okinoshima. You could look around and see volcanoes smoking all around. And while there, I endured drought, flood, earthquake, and hurricanes, all within about a year time period. It was an isolated tour, unaccompanied tour. There were about 120 Americans on that island. It was, as I said, 3.5 by 4 miles, and it was isolated. The only way in and out was by landing craft. That's the way they brought our mail, and they brought our food. And if you left, unless it was an emergency, that's the way you left. I had a little accident while I was there and fractured my wrist. And they finally sent a helicopter out to get me. And it took them 2 days to get the helicopter out there and get me back in. Turned out it wasn't a major fracture or anything, but that was how isolated it was. I learned a lot in the Air Force. It was a great experience, and again, it helped me to kind of understand who I am. Well, my focus in life has changed again from immediate family to marriage to grandkids and to kids. And this is a picture of Shauna and Steve and her family. This is a picture of Nathan and Kim and their family. And this is a picture of the state champion basketball player, two Olympic caliber track and basketball stars, and a great baseball player, okay? This is Hayden and Landon and Lindsay and Brennan. They are 13, 14, 15, and 16. And we spend a lot of our time going to athletic events, and they compete well. Okay, now that is the introduction, and I'm almost done here, right? that is the introduction to why it's unusual to be where I am. I have no family background to college. I came back to LCU after the Air Force realizing I would have to complete a master's degree, and so I immediately jumped into that. I started working here at $650 a month. I taught 15 hours the first semester I was back. Came back in January of '71, taught 15 hours. Some of them I'd had courses in, some of them I hadn't. First course I remember teaching was dairy science. I'd never been around dairy cattle. I never had a course in dairy cattle, but I taught dairy cattle. But I knew I had to have a master's, so I got in and got real quickly, and within about a year and a half, completed a master's degree in reproductive physiology. And that particular thesis that I did had to do with the effect of confinement upon the age of puberty in gilts. And I took 65 gilts that were had been in a finishing pen up to about 220 pounds, moved them out of that pen into 3 different size pens. One was small, had about 7 square feet per head, which was like a finishing pen. One of them had about 128 square feet, and one of them about 72 square feet. For 90 days, 128 days, I don't remember the exact number of days, I checked those suckers every day for estrus. And there are ways to do that requires your presence. And when they would show signs of estrus, we would take those animals and slaughter them, and I would extract the pituitary gland, the adrenal glands, and the reproductive tract, and measure each of those to see if there was any difference based upon the confinement in space and what have you that they were in. No difference in any of those glands or organs that were there, but there was a substantial difference in age of puberty of these gilts in the small pen as compared to the other two. About, in that particular case, it was an average of about 50 days later for those gilts to come into estrus that were in the confinement. Also, it was more difficult to detect estrus in the pens. I missed more of them there than the ones that were in the open pens. And one other thing we found on it was that when you checked the ovary, you could tell whether they had ovulated or not. And many times the ones in the small confined pen would show signs of estrus and never ovulate, which was who knows why, but it was interesting. Okay, so now here's the rest of my story. I got that done in, I think it was '73 when that was finished. Now, I had no intentions of going any further. The only reason I continued to take courses at Tech was because, number one, I kind of enjoyed the learning process. And there were lots of courses out there I could take, but more importantly than that, the government would pay me almost as much money as I was making at LCU to take courses. Now, who wouldn't do that? And so I took, I have no idea how many courses I have, but I took every course they offered in the animal science department. I took courses in the environmental engineering area. I took courses in chemistry. I took courses in biology. I took courses in biochemistry. I took courses in business. Now, you say, well, why would you do that? And I say, well, I got to teach organic chemistry, which I have. I got to teach computer science. I took some of those, and I got to have 18 hours in those. I'm going to teach farm and ranch management, so I got to have ag eco. And so all of these things that I'm going to have to teach, and I know I'm going to have to teach, I'll just take courses in them and I'll be qualified by SACS. Well, along the way, I thought, well, you know, I got all these courses, why don't I go ahead and see about doing a PhD? And a guy by the name of Dr. Sam Curl, who was a really unique guy over at Tech, and I'd had him for a class, and he was also involved in my master's thesis and what have you, kept encouraging me to do that. And so I started this process, and I switched from reproductive physiology to nutrition. And the big thing then had to do with protein and how protein is utilized in the body, and how protein affects utilization of other nutrients in the food that the animal is eating. So we said, all right, I got to give you a little bit of history here. Not history, but a little bit of learning for you. So here you go. Whenever you feed a protein to a ruminant animal, that's cattle, they have a compound stomach. And in the rumen of that, the protein that comes in is degraded, or it is changed from whatever the food protein is into bacterial protein. And then it goes on down into the small intestine where it's digested into amino acids and can be utilized by the body. Well, if you're feeding a good quality protein, which means it matches the structure of whatever produce you're trying to get, growth or milk or reproduction or whatever, the amino acid sequences match that product, and it's a good quality protein, and it's used efficiently. Well, bacterial protein is not a high quality protein, or it's not as high quality protein as what you can get mixing soybeans and corn, or soybeans and milo, or something like that. And so what was happening is, whenever you'd feed that to a ruminant animal, the protein would be degraded to a lower quality protein, then going down into the digestive tract and be digested. So let's figure out a way to bypass the rumen and put the high quality protein down where it can be utilized. So there's chemicals you can use to block the nitrogen where it can't be taken off of the protein and then reincorporated into another carbohydrate skeleton. So you do that, and then you got to figure out how to tell whether you're doing any good or not. So using a vet, we created bypasses out of the digestive system so that the digestive material can literally come outside the stomach, outside the digestive tract, and you can sample it and figure out what's happening through the digestive process. So there's a hole here that comes out, a hole here that goes back in, another hole down in the very end of the true stomach where it comes out and goes back into the small intestine. And so you can tell what happens to it when it comes in because you know what you fed. You can tell what happens to it when it leaves the rumen because it's coming out there. And you can tell what happens just before it goes into the small intestine where it's going to be digested because it's coming out there. Great, right? It's a great project. They all died. I don't understand that. Do you? I mean, 4 holes in your digestive tract? I don't understand why they'd die, but they did. I was going to show you slides of that, and I thought, this is a little gross. So I didn't. So I just said, okay, it's over. I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm not going to do a PhD. A few weeks, well, I don't know how long it was, but some point in time after that, I get the call. He calls me in the office, and he says, I want you to complete your PhD. And I said, nah, I'm not going to do that. He said, give me 2 reasons why not. I said, well, first, why don't you let some of these young bucks like Kurt Martin go out and do that instead of me? And he says, no, you give me 2 reasons why. Give me the reasons why you can't do that. I said, money and time. He said, what if we take care of those? I said, So I did. Started on the next project. He told me this morning, I didn't even know this, but Dr. Curl, who was still over at Tech, and he were friends because of connection between their sons and because they were in the same civic club, were at a table before that conversation talking about my animals all dying, and Dr. Curl saying, tell him to get back over here and we see if we can't work something out. I didn't know that until this morning. And so he told me that this morning, how that came about. And sure enough, I got back over there and they took all of those courses that I had taken and everything that I had already done, and they said, if you can pass the qualifying exams, you won't have to take any more courses. Okay, so I passed the qualifying exams. And then we designed this experiment that, man, I'm not going to have time to do this. That again had to do with nutrition and ruminant animals. Now, the two major sources of energy for ruminant animals are grain sorghum and corn in feedlots. And if you just take ground corn and ground sorghum, the difference between those two is about, well, grain sorghum has about 90% the value of corn. And there are lots of reasons for that, and I'll maybe get a chance to tell you about that in a minute. But there's also this prejudice against, and you've experienced this prejudice against grain sorghum. You don't ever go into a restaurant and say you're going to buy grain sorghum fed beef. What do you go in and buy? You buy corn fed beef. Well, it's all energy. So is there really a difference? And so part of my study was, does corn actually have any value in terms of the quality of the meat that you get from an animal? And does it actually have an increase in value in terms of rate of gain or efficiency of gain or any of those kinds of things? Now, we already knew before that if you do extreme processing of grain sorghum, that its energy value approaches that of corn. If you take it and grind it, there's a difference. If you take corn and grain sorghum and cook it, there's not any difference. But if you take corn and grain sorghum and steam flake both of them, you get about a 20% increase in value in grain sorghum and about a 5% increase in value of corn, which makes them equal, okay? So the question is that really true? And does it work? And if so, why? All right. Well, in the study, I had 252 steers that we put into 4 different treatments that had corn, grain sorghum by themselves, and then corn with fat, a 2% fat, and grain sorghum with 2% fat, in this incredible research facility that Tech has out there. Small pens, concrete slatted floors, automatic feed bunks, it was great. You just sit there and watch the feed fall into the bunks, and you test it and see if it's the right kind of thing, and they eat, and you keep track of all of that. But we did, it was about 160 days they were on feed. And at the end of that, we did average daily gain, efficiency of gain, all of the things that you'd do to measure that. No difference. Exactly the same. Well, the question still is, which is better? Which tastes better? Corn-fed beef or grain sorghum-fed beef? So here's where the real work came in. Those animals had to be slaughtered, which is what you're going to do with them anyway for feed. They go up to Plainview to the slaughterhouse up there, and they have professional graders that grade the quality of the carcass, and then they do a yield grade kind of thing on it, and you can actually compare those things and say, is there any difference in the quality of the carcass, in the grade of the carcass, or in the yield grade? And for corn and grain sorghum, there's no difference. It turns out exactly the same. But you still don't know about how it tastes. So, on the left side of the carcass, when you go to a restaurant and buy a ribeye steak, that's called the longissimus dorsi muscle, and it runs all the way through, and in between the 9th, 10th, and 11th, and 12th rib, I took 64 of those, took them out of that, brought them back to the lab, and did a lot of things with it. I don't have time to tell you all the things we did with it. Basically, we figured out how much seam fat, how much marbling, how much subcutaneous fat, how much lean, the size of the longissimus dorsi, how much bone in each one of those, and then had a taste panel in which we actually, well, we also did tenderness test with a Warner-Brasler shear test, that kind of thing, which is very specific in the way you do that. And then I did a taste panel where you had 6 or 8 trained tasters. Now, I'm a trained tester, okay? No. But we had trained testers that, through very controlled mechanisms, never knowing what they were eating, would take samples of these steaks. Now, they're not flavored or anything, but then they would grade them in terms of juiciness, the flavor, the tenderness, all of the things that you look for in a steak. No difference. So, the next time somebody wants to charge you extra for corn-fed beef, tell them baloney. Give me grain sorghum and I'll pay less, okay? And it'll be the same. Actually, there was a couple of differences. The corn-fed beef had a lower yield grade and more mature-looking meat than did the grain sorghum. Now, both of those are bad in the favor of corn because you want youthful-appearing meat, and yield grade has to do with how much fat you've got that's external to the marbling. The more fat you have, the higher the yield grade, okay?
What about color of fat?
Color of fat was no difference. The color of the fat was the same. Great question, though, but it was the same.
Of course it was.
I've got the proof right here for you. Okay, now, well, that's all I've already said. There is less subcutaneous fat in the grain sorghum than in the other. Now, okay. Now here's where it really gets complicated. Why? Why is that true? Why steam flaking does it have such an impact on grain sorghum and not on corn? And I want to attempt really quickly to give you a little lesson in biochemistry. I know you're excited about this, so hang on. Whoops. That's not going to help you any. Yeah.
So after you killed all those cows in your study, did you bury them?
I couldn't be sure they were dead, so no, I didn't bury them. Thank you for that question, though, Michelle. That was very insightful. Okay. Which one do I want to show you here? How about we do this one right here? Maybe it'll work. No, let me do insulin.
You look more excited today, Rob, than you have been.
I'm just trying to get this over with. Okay. This is a very simple protein called insulin. It's a very simple protein. But what I want you to see is these two little yellow dots here that you see. And what that represents is two molecules of sulfur. And in between them is a bond that is called a disulfide bond. And it is a covalent bond that is one of the strongest bonds that you find in any of the parts of the protein. So that little bond right there is the key from what happens in steam flaking. If you can literally break that bond, what happens is the protein begins to unravel and begins to separate into sometimes totally separate subunits. So these bonds can be intra or molecular, and depending on how they're broken, that thing begins to unfold. Now, in the corn, let me show you a complicated one here so you get that's a real simple one, okay? Here's a much more complicated protein that you can that you can see how all of that is. By the way, the orange, the red is oxygen, the blue is nitrogen, some of the gray is hydrogen, some of it's carbon. But you can kind of see in that. Do you want me to stop it from circulating? Is it making you dizzy? But you can kind of see how that is. Now, if you look, you can begin to see some of the kinds of structure. God, that makes you dizzy. You can see some of the way the structures are. There are holes that are in between these chains and what have you. And in the corn and in the grain sorghum, the starch, which is the energy source in there, is intertwined in this protein matrix. And so you have this protein matrix that is surrounding the starch. And in order for the starch digesting enzymes to get to that energy, they have to be able to get through that protein matrix. Well, the protein that's found in grain sorghum has a lot more of those disulfide bonds that are present in it. And because of that, the protein is much more tightly wound around the globules of salt in the grain sorghum than they are in the corn. So whenever you grind it, it doesn't disrupt those things very much. When you cook it, it doesn't disrupt it very much. It does, but it allows it to reconnect. The steam flaking involves running corn down, or the grain sorghum, the grain, whatever it is, down through a steam chamber where the temperature gets up to about 100 degrees and very high moisture for about 30 minutes. And what that does is produce a tremendously reducing environment, which breaks that bond and lets it become sulfhydryls. That's sulfur with hydrogens on it. And these things are separated out here now, and the protein unravels. Now, if you leave it alone, those things would rejoin themselves back, and the protein would stay basically in the same shape. But what you do is you shear it, and all of a sudden, all of these sulfhydryls that are floating out here in space are separated so far from each other they can't form that disulfide bond and pull that protein molecule back together. Hey, let me give you ladies an example. When you get a permanent, okay, your hair is made up of primarily protein, and it's got a lot of these cysteine amino acids which contain that sulfur. And when you get a permanent, they put something on your hair that breaks that bond. That's the first thing that happens. And then they put it in a curler which changes the shape of that protein so that all of a sudden those sulfhydryls are no longer able to join each other. And if you had straight hair, it comes back to the shape of the curler that you had in there. And that's the same thing that's happening with this right here. Now, I said all of that to say that's why you do that. Well, what happened is I developed a way to measure the amount of sulfhydryl bonds that were broken using amphiometric titration, and it's a huge complicated mess, that tells me how many sulfhydryls showed up that were no longer attached as disulfide bonds. So you can measure the degree of denaturing of the protein that's taken place. And that was the second half of my dissertation. That was Cargill, which is at that time was one of the largest companies in agriculture companies around, still is, I guess, asked for me to sign an agreement for them to do a patent on that process. However, what they were looking for was the ability to take a tube and break it and put a sample of grain in it, and it would tell them how much they had processed that grain. This was much more complicated than that, so it didn't go anywhere. But it was interesting to explore the field of chemistry with nutrition, and you need to see, if you're really interested and you want to see the reagents and the process that this went through, it's all written out here. I was telling somebody the other day, and I'm done, by the way. I'm coming around and check your pulse in a minute. Whenever I pulled this out to look at it, I said, I started looking at it, and I'm thinking, I have no clue what that's talking about. Because I hadn't looked at it in that way in so long, and it's not something you go back to and look. And all of the abbreviations, what is LCM, what is SCL, what is SUB, all those kind of things. And so it was a step through learning all the abbreviations again. And of course they were just abbreviations that I used in my dissertation, because you don't want to write out subcutaneous fat every time you talk about it. Okay, I'm done. Questions?
So, Dr. Blackwood.
I knew you'd ask one.
It's always my prerogative for the first question. What has been the greatest change at LCU since you've been here? It could be greatest in any definition of the term.
Man, I don't know. That's a hard. You can't imagine. Steve might be able to imagine. Sandra probably could. You might even be able to. You can't imagine the amount of change that has taken place at LCU over a time period. I remember never knowing for sure you were going to get paid. I remember teaching 18 or 20 hours with 3 or 4 labs, 3-hour labs a week. I can remember those things. I can remember doing that plus managing the farm. I'm not saying we don't work hard now. I'm not saying we worked harder then. I'm just saying it's a different mentality. We've become more academic in our nature. We're more concerned about the quality of what we're doing than we were back in those days. We were just doing the best we could, and everybody was having to do that. I think we're in a much better place with the fact that we are so concerned about quality and teaching loads and those kind of things. I'm also glad we don't have to worry about getting paid every month. That's kind of a nice change.
Someone else?
Andy.
No, Not Andy.
All right, well, let's have a conversation.
I have an animal science question.
Okay.
It's really not for you and I, it's for everybody else.
Okay.
Can you approximate how much money your research using animals probably costs?
I have not ever sat down and tried to figure that out. It was funded through a grant. The grant was for, as I recall, about $250,000. That did not include any labor that was involved, or wear and tear, or expense of in the feed mill, of preparing this, or of people cleaning out the pens, or any of that. It didn't include people paying for the slaughter and for the grading or any of that kind of stuff. Just for the, my memory is $250,000 on the grant. Grain sorghum paid for it, by the way.
That's just for that. That's not vet bills. That's not everything else. All those things.
Now, I will tell you an interesting thing. The method that I used to detect those sulfhydrals was done right over here in the water laboratory with an old piece of equipment that they had quit using, that would measure the voltage change in the liquid based upon titration of the sulfhydrals with, you don't want to know all of that, but anyway, it would cause a change of the electric current flow, and this thing would pick it up, but it wasn't well insulated, and so the wires that came back from it, I wished I'd taken pictures of this, but these wires are running everywhere, and I had tinfoil wrapped around those things to keep, you know, when I first started, I could walk by this thing and it would jump. And so I had to figure out a way to protect it from outside influence.
Working in the
You probably do. But it was there was a guy, and I've got it in my dissertation. The guy that helped me with that instrumentation thing was one of the guys that worked over here in the lab, and he was just really nice. Tech did finally break down and buy me a computer that would allow it to go directly onto that, and an electrode that was sulfur, was specific for measuring sulfur ion in solutions. So, yes?
What are some of your favorite books? I'm thinking literature. This is just because.
the size of long distance horse.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, I'm gonna answer that question by telling you this story. High school, I was not a great student. As a matter of fact, when I came to LCU, Norma Ruth Rose, who was an assistant at the registrar then, I went in to enroll and everything, and she pulled out my folder, and she looks at my grades, and she looks at my test scores, and she said, "Did you cheat on those test scores?" I'm thinking, what? No, ma'am, I didn't cheat. I wouldn't cheat. Of course, she was being funny because my test scores were much higher than my high school. Well, let me tell you what I did during high school. Whenever I'd go into an English class or a literature class, I didn't care what the teacher said. I was reading the literature. I was reading the stories. And I rode a bus for 2 hours every morning and every night to and from school. And I spent that whole time reading. Well, not all the time. Sometimes I was getting in trouble, but most of the time I spent reading. But I love to read, and I love reading. I love reading classics. I've read a lot of that, but I just like to read mysteries, adventure things. So you want specific books? Well, the one of them I'm working on right now is The Forgotten by David Baldacci. I love reading some of Vince Flynn's stuff. I have one now called The Last Man that he's written. I'm working on. I'm also listening as I jog and what have you to a book by Dale Brown called Shadow Command. It's about space and what can happen if you utilize satellites for war, weapon systems. Yeah, that's not very sophisticated, is it?
That is fine. I really love that also.
Who was a mystery writer you were telling me? Stockard, was that his name?
Mystery writer.
Mystery. Who done it? You know, you were telling me somebody.
Oh,
Something.
well, Lee Childs. I read a lot of Lee Childs stuff. mystery.
Stop, Dale, stop.
Doesn't ring a bell. Doesn't ring a bell. Doesn't ring a bell right now.
Well, I would like to say that Dr. Blackwood likes to pretend that he's not poetic, but obviously his presentation shows that he is. His use of photographs and what he had to say about them. You are a poet.
Thank you.
You have a poetic
I didn't hear anything that rhymed. Is that all that poetic is?
Only a poet.
Let's give Dr. Blackwood a hand.